Hello. So class is now being conducted in my family room. But I thought, especially for Kant, and since I've already sent a lot of stuff out on discussion boards, it'd be good for me to explain some of the stuff just to see where we are. And Kant's one of these seminal figures that really is kind of a restart to philosophy. So he's building off of Hume. So here I've got Hume, his relations of ideas, his matters of fact, and then everything else that's not one of those two, then he says should be cast to the flames. Things such as metaphysics. So as I mentioned in the discussion board, then metaphysics is nice for curiosity, nice to get the brain going in the morning, but we shouldn't be taking the thing too seriously. He's sort of an anti-philosophy philosopher. And so these relations of ideas, then, this is just a chart way of seeing the things I already wrote. So relations of ideas are what they claim to be. They relate ideas. They don't deal with perception. There's the loophole that he thinks he's found in what Berkeley was talking about. So they're certain 100% every time. They're guaranteed, but they're also not particularly informative because every new piece of information merely confirms the thing you already knew. They don't require perception. They're also not particularly interesting because you're not learning anything new. And for those of you who don't like mathematics, you can confirm that. So primarily what he's talking about here are the laws of mathematics, algebra, so on and so forth. All triangles have three sides and three angles that add up to 180. That's the definition of a triangle. It's what a triangle is. In addition then to mathematics, we also have, technically it's called tautologies, but really it's things that are true by definition. Most classic example, bachelors are unmarried males. So you don't have to go out and take a survey and ask bachelors, hey, are you unmarried? You know, by definition, that's what a bachelor is. They are unmarried males, period, all of the time, everywhere. So this knowledge then is also universal. This deals merely with the intellect. So there is a connection here between Hume's relations of ideas and Plato's intelligible realm, right, that have nothing to do with the senses. Remember in the divided line, here's the chasm, right? Here's the cave opening. Out of the cave, above the divided line, then we have things like mathematical truths, which have to do merely with the mind. And then for Plato, then he goes on to talk about forms, which have to do with the soul. Hume doesn't go that direction. It's too metaphysical for him. And he's attempting to limit metaphysical speculation. Again, it's only good for exciting curiosity, so on and so forth. So that's one legitimate class of human inquiry, relations of ideas. The second legitimate class then is matters of fact. So these are all of the things of science, right? Science doesn't prove that it will happen again the next time. It merely gives us an extremely high probability that it'll happen again the next time. And he relates all of this to cause and effect. Pardon me. So at the beginning of the excerpt that I referenced, I think it's like 435 or something along those lines, before the science bit, where Cottingham talks about, look, we got these billiard balls. One billiard ball moves, hits another billiard ball, then the other billiard ball moves, but you never observe cause and effect. You just observe one thing happening and another thing happening. And so cause and effect is always a post hoc fallacy for Hume. But these matters of fact, given the high degree of probability after you've seen it over and over and over and over and over and over again, and we've seen this how many billions of times at this point in our lives. But to the toddler, to the newborn, it's new. Whoa! They don't know what to expect. We do know what to expect. We would be surprised if that didn't happen. If I were performing a magic trick or something, I let go and it didn't fall, we'd be surprised. Our expectations would be disappointed. But we act as if it's certain. And so Hume here is also laying the groundwork for things like pragmatism, which we'll probably hopefully get around to doing, which I had you guys read weeks ago. We'll see. And so we can only talk about, as a matter of fact, this thing happened again. So here's your empiricism. Right? This is all the stuff of Plato's visible realm. You're referring to the senses, and then the senses plus the mind, you're making these connections. But this is not abstract. This is the concrete stuff. This is the abstract stuff over here. Pardon me. But with this stuff, since it's empirical, since it's about the world, that's why we can't be certain about it. This stuff's not really about the world. This stuff is about the world. So the best we have is probability. But that's also what makes it then interesting and informative. We can learn new things. We're not making new discoveries about triangles. We may be applying the truths that we already know about triangles to new problems. But triangles themselves are not changing. So Kant then is this fellow who grew up in Königsberg, lived in Königsberg, went to school in Königsberg, taught in Königsberg, like he never left town. He was a man of regularity. The neighbors were said to be able to set their clocks to his daily walks. And he was fine. He, in some ways, was kind of like a philosophical monk. He didn't have a family because he wanted to devote himself to philosophy, the study of it, and the teaching of it. And so he comes along, he reads David Hume, this wacky Scotsman, who is basically very close to dismissing metaphysics entirely. And Hume awakens Kant from his philosophical slumber. Kant had never written anything. He was in his mid-60s. He'd never written any philosophy text. He was content just teaching. But Hume incensed him so much, and I don't even know if incensed is the right word, because really Kant is going to be building upon Hume. Without Hume doing what Hume does, I don't know that Kant ever ends up providing the Copernican revolution to philosophy that he does. The more I read, the more I think Hume is really the one who has the Copernican revolution, but Kant's the one he gets credit for, because this is what Kant's intending to do. Kant is explicitly trying to combine Platonic metaphysics and Aristotelian metaphysics. I really like Cunningham's subtitle to this particular excerpt, and this is the excerpt from part 2, although I'll be referencing both. I'll start with the excerpt from part 2, then go to the excerpt from part 1, then probably back to the excerpt from part 2. Metaphysics, old and new. So old metaphysics is the subject-object stuff, this translation problem that's been with us at least since Descartes, probably even since Aristotle, maybe even since Plato. But Descartes talks about this, right? The physical beings and the mental images. Locke builds upon that. Then Berkeley comes along and tries to make it all mental stuff. Then we get Hume finding the loophole. And Kant is kind of tying all of these things together. Just like Plato was kind of a compendium of all of the thought of that time and previously, Kant is going to be also, Kant's going to be drawing upon not just Plato and Aristotle, but the entire rest of the lineage, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. So Kant thinks metaphysics is worth saving, but a new type of metaphysics, and we'll talk about what that is later. But in order to save metaphysics, he's got to find a legitimate, he needs to define it as a legitimate human inquiry, right? So he's going to start with Hume's structure here in an attempt to save metaphysics, which means he can't rely merely upon relations of ideas and matters of fact. So instead, he's going to draw some clearer distinctions. So a couple of the terms I didn't put here with relations of ideas and matters of fact that I should have, but I wanted to have time to explain them, are a priori and a posteriori. So these relations of ideas are going to be a priori. What that means then is prior to experience, or no experience necessary. The reason no experience is necessary is because, again, you already have the truth of it. You already know it, as long as you properly understand the idea. And again, an improper understanding of an idea is a mistake. You're just wrong. Over here in the relations of ideas, there's correct and incorrect. If you think a triangle's angles add up to 200, you're just wrong. Over here, this isn't necessarily about wrong. This is because it's about perception. Like Berkeley pointed out and like Locke pointed out, I don't like using the words fact and opinion. I know a couple of you did in the discussion board. I think that's a bit misleading. I'm not even sure what those terms mean anymore, like I've talked about before. But let's say these truths are much more subjective. Okay, not to say they're completely subjective, but more subjective than these ones are. Why? Because these ones are based upon experience. Whose experience? My experience. So these then are a posteriori. a posteriori. And we can equate that to things like cause and effect, right? You have to have the experience of cause and effect to have the generalized concept of cause and effect. Very Aristotelian, right? The concept building thing we talked about 5,000 years ago, it seems like now, right? So these a posteriori truths, again, give us some predictive power, because it's probably, but it's not complete and certain. We can imagine the sun not rising again tomorrow, to use Hume's example. We have to experience it again the next time to ensure, oh, as a matter of fact, it was true again today. I don't know about tomorrow. I'm pretty sure about tomorrow, but I don't know for certain. So we've got these a priori and a posteriori. And that's going to play a role in what Kant is doing. Kant, instead of splitting the world into two, is going to give us quadrants. So he's going to talk about a priori and a posteriori. But instead of focusing on the experience aspect of those terms, he's going to focus on the necessary or contingent aspect of those terms. The reason that experience isn't necessary here is because they're necessarily the case. All bachelors are necessarily unmarried males. All triangles necessarily have three sides and triangles that up to 180. There's a necessity there. That's the point that Kant is going to focus on, is the necessity aspect. A posteriori, then, is not necessarily the case. It's contingent. It's probably. It's if certain conditions are met. Relations of ideas are going to pertain to alls. All bachelors. All bodies are heavy. All. Or, conversely then, none. Right? No bachelors are married, for instance. Matters of fact are going to be more about some. Some bachelors are messy. Some bachelors are not messy. You need to then go take a survey to find out which ones are which. It's going to be contingent. So we have a priori, a posteriori. But where he begins this particular excerpt, so this is page 109, is drawing the distinction between analytic and synthetic. Analytic truths are these ones, the ones that are true by definition. You can determine their truth or falsehood merely by analyzing what it's saying, merely by analyzing the sentence structure. And this analytic thing is where the analytic philosophers, primarily the Brits of the 1900s, derive their name, right? They're the ones that focus on logic. They're the ones that are about what do you mean when you say, analyzing sentences, right? I talked about that even longer ago. It was like day 2 of class. Okay. So we have these analytic statements, and so Kant himself says, analytic judgments say nothing in the predicate, but what was already thought in the conception of the subject. Right? So again, if you have a proper concept, a proper idea, a proper understanding of the subject of the sentence, then you already know the predicate to be true. And notice here too, Kant is attempting to explicitly combine rationalism and empiricism, Plato and Aristotle. So he's going to use Platonic language and Aristotelian language. Remember, Aristotle wanted to talk about subject-predicate relationships to demonstrate his metaphysics, right? That the subject is the important part of the sentence. Bucephalus is strong. Bucephalus is a complete sentence. Is strong is not, which indicates the subject is the important part. The subject is the primary substance. Go back to Aristotle. So Kant here, again, being a professor of philosophy, is extremely intentional about every reference he makes. One of the difficulties with Kant is that he's attempting to be so precise about everything that the definitions, you sometimes lose track of, wait, where's the forest here? We're focusing on each particular tree so intently that you forget there's a forest there. So that's part of why Kant is more difficult even to write to explain about. My thesis advisor at Kent State, Dr. Kwang-Se Lee. This was after years and years and years of teaching Kant in a Kant seminar. Probably 50 years of teaching, maybe even longer than that. Not quite sure how old he really was. He seemed ancient. Taught himself German so that he could read Kant in the original language. Did his dissertation on Kant from the leading Kant scholar in the United States at the time at Yale. Walked into class one day in a Kant seminar and said, guys, I think I'm finally starting to understand Kant. Starting to? After all this, you're starting to? So Kant is notoriously difficult. But here he's referencing Aristotle, the subject-predicate stuff. So analytic judgments tell you nothing in the predicate that you didn't already know if you properly understood what the subject was. Again, like bachelors and unmarried males. You already knew they were unmarried as long as you properly understood bachelorhood. That's why we can speak of necessity. That's why we can speak about alls and nones. That's why we don't need to go out into the world to determine these things. They're true by definition. Okay? So it's analytic, and these truths that are true by definition are also necessarily the case. So that's why they're analytic. You determine the truth just by analyzing the sentence structure, but they're also a priori because they are necessarily the case. So in this quadrant of analytic a priori, we have things like definitions, things that are true by definition, tautologies, at least some of Hume's relations of ideas. Analytic a posteriori doesn't exist. It wouldn't make sense. It can't be both contingent and also derive the truth merely by analyzing the sentence structure. Right? A posteriori and analytic do not go together. So that quadrant is going to be empty. It's going to be null. Now let's move on to synthetic judgments. Still page 109. The proposition, some bodies are heavy, contains something in the predicate which was not already thought in the general conception of a body. It enlarges my knowledge insofar as it adds something to my conception and must therefore be termed synthetic. So these synthetic judgments then, the truth can't be derived merely by definition, merely by analyzing the sentence structure. I've got to have additional information, right? So like some bachelors are messy. Notice here too the use of the word some rather than all. Again, indicating contingency. So it would seem obviously that has to do with contingency, has to do with experience. So synthetic and a posteriori seem to go together rather nicely. This is really Hume's matters of fact. The truths of things like science, for instance. So what the heck is Kant doing that's different then? I mean, basically, don't we just have relations of ideas and matters of fact? This one's a null set. This is where it gets complicated. Like the rest of this stuff was so simple, right? So we've got synthetic a priori. This quadrant right here. If Kant is going to save metaphysics, this is where it has to go. What does synthetic a priori then mean? Well, it means that there's the possibility for new information and new knowledge. I don't know it merely by looking at the sentence structure, but that it's also not contingent. It's necessarily the case. But it'd be really suspicious if Kant does all of this, throws metaphysics in here and says, see, I saved it, ta-da. Instead, what he does is he has to establish the legitimacy of this category here first, using something other than metaphysics to demonstrate, look, this is a legitimate thing. Then he can go on to add metaphysics to this otherwise legitimate thing. And he's going to start with math. So again, Intro to Philosophy's become philosophy of math class. Math is this weird special thing when it comes to knowledge, right? Because it doesn't deal with perception. It does seem to be a bit more than just agreed upon truths, Again, mathematics and mathematical formulas are the thing we send out into space, presuming that if there's other life out there, they will at least understand math the same way that we do, even if everything else about them is different. That's crazy. And so Kant thinks that Hume has gotten the understanding of mathematics wrong, that mathematics is not merely relating ideas. Why not? Well, here's why. Now, we've been doing addition for years and years and years and years, right? But let's take my 4-year-old daughter, for instance, right? Mathematics is new to her because she's 4, right? So she's still working on understanding the concept of addition. If I ask her what's 5 plus 7, she doesn't yet understand it's necessarily, I'm using that word intentionally here, necessarily 12. We say things like 5 plus 7 is 12. We replace the equal sign with the word is. 5 plus 7 is 12, necessarily, every single time. It's certain. It's also not particularly informative, so on and so forth. So it seems like we're merely relating ideas together. That's not what we're doing. Because let's look at it this way. 12 is 5 plus 7. No, it's not. Not necessarily. We talked about this when we did the deductive patterns, right? 12 could be any number of combinations. 5 plus 7 is just one of the combinations. 5 plus 7 is necessarily 12. 12 is not necessarily the same as 5 plus 7. It could be 6 plus 6, or 3 plus 9, or 12 times 1. Any number of things. Literally innumerable number of possibilities here. But if it's like bachelors or unmarried males, we can say unmarried male is bachelor. We can reverse these. We can reverse the definitional stuff. We can reverse the predicate with the subject in a way that we can't with mathematics. It's imprecise to say is instead of equals to. And that's Kant's point on page 110. So if mathematics isn't really definitional in the way that Hume claims it is, then we got to have a different place to put it. It's not a relation of idea, it's something else. Aha! How about synthetic a priori? It's necessarily the case. A priori, the truths of mathematics are not contingent. They're true all the time, everywhere. But they're not true by definition. They're not tautologies. So they must go here. And for the past over 200 years since Kant wrote this, it's all been about whether synthetic a priori propositions are a thing or not. And Kant knows that that's what it's going to be about. On page 111, almost right smack dab in the middle, in all caps. Of course, this is translated from the German. I don't know if it's capitalized in the German or not. I don't read German, so I don't have the German text. The proper problem on which everything turns, when expressed with scholastic precision, will accordingly stand thus. How are synthetic propositions a priori possible? ... Upon the solution of this problem, the standing or falling of metaphysics, in other words, its very existence, entirely depends. It all depends upon whether Kant is right that synthetic a priori propositions are a thing or not. Because if they're not, then Hume is right, metaphysics should be cast to the flames, end of story. That I've wasted everyone's time the past, I don't know, whenever we started with Plato, a month or so ago. Probably more than that now. And I've wasted everyone's time. We should be focusing on science, which you get that in your science classes. We should be focusing on defining stuff better, hopefully to help the sciences. That's the point of philosophy. Kant thinks there's more to it than that. That's part of it. That's part of it. But this synthetic a priori thing is part of it too. Because math is not definitional in the same way that tautologies are. 12 equals 7 plus 5 is not the same thing as bachelors or unmarried males. That my daughter can understand the concept of 5. She can understand the concept of 7. She can even understand properly the concept of addition, but still not know that the answer then is 12. When you take 5 and you add it to 7, bam, 12. Again, if she properly understands bachelor, she already knows they're unmarried males. So it's different, Kant thinks. And so if we've carved out this special niche for mathematics, the synthetic a priori thing, I wonder what else might go there. Gee, I don't know. Let's try metaphysics. This is going to be a new type of metaphysics, not the old subject-object stuff. This new type of metaphysics that Kant is going to focus on, we don't even call metaphysics anymore. We have an entire department devoted to the type of metaphysics Kant is talking about, and it's not the metaphysics department. It's the psychology department. The new type of metaphysics that Kant is concerning himself with is what he calls concepts of the understanding, or structures of the mind. That's what metaphysics is. Metaphysics isn't, gee, is actual reality stable or is it in flux? Who cares? The important thing is, how on earth do we experience it? And so the way we experience it is based upon us. And so here he's building upon Locke. This isn't just the way that I experience it. This is the way all of us necessarily, that's why it's a priori, necessarily experience it. It seems to be more than coincidental that we all experience the world with cause and effect, for instance. Hume thinks, hey, stuff happens, then because we have to generalize, we'll just slap the label cause and effect on the thing and move on with life. Kant thinks it's the exact opposite, and he says as much. This is on page 113, where he talks about the complete solution to Hume's problem. Hume's problem, remember, is he's trying to find cause and effect out there. Can't find it out there, so he figures it must be in here. That part Kant agrees, it is in here. But Hume reverses the order of things, Kant thinks. Hume thinks stuff happens, then we generalize and heap on the concept cause and effect. Kant thinks that cause and effect is one of these initial structures of the mind, one of the initial concepts of the understanding. Why we all experience it that way is because it's universal. It's necessarily the case. It's part of being a human. Our minds come already structured to experience the world through cause and effect. Otherwise, we could decide not to. Kant thinks if Hume is right, we just decide to stop experiencing the world of cause and effect. Oh, wow, there's an event. Huh, there's another event. That's weird. Right? And so we'll do this. Hey, here's an event. Another event. I'll choose to experience them as completely unrelated. And we just can't do that. We necessarily connect these things together. We necessarily connect the moving of one ball, the hitting of the other, and the movement of that second ball. We connect them all together. All of us connect them all together. The generalization doesn't happen after the fact. The generalization is what we're looking for. Our minds are looking for cause and effect. It's already structured to see the world that way, to experience the world that way. The other primary structure of the understanding, structure of the mind, one of the primary concepts of the understanding, and I keep calling them primary, that's for clarification purposes, that's not the phrase that he uses. These primary concepts of the understanding is four-dimensionality. We experience the world in time and space. All of us, necessarily. Even people who don't have full access to all five of their senses are still experiencing the world temporally and spatially. That's crazy. That's crazy. Our minds, therefore, must be structured ahead of time to experience the world that way. All of us necessarily, a priori. But the structures, these concepts, are what allow for the possibility of new understanding and new information. Synthetic a priori. Psychology is still working on the structures of the mind, the concepts of the understanding. What is the thing that we all share? How is it that we all experience the world in similar ways? Are there differences? Of course. It's because experience is different. But as different as experience is, we still agree on a whole heck of a lot of stuff. What's up with that? What's up with that is these initial concepts of the understanding or structures of the mind. So, and that's where the excerpt from part 1 comes in. So this is page 40, starting on page 40. And remember, he's explicitly attempting to combine Plato and Aristotle here, right? In a way that Hume merely implicitly sort of did, because he was trying to defeat Berkeley. He was trying to have knowledge without perception and without God. Kant's taking it the next step further. I should indicate, too, I forgot to mention this part before, part of Kant's Platonic influence can be seen just in what he writes. He wrote 3 major works: Critique of Pure Reason, which is where this excerpt comes from, and that's his main treatise and his main work on truth. Critique of Practical Reason. By critique, he's just talking about a critical examination of. Critique of Practical Reason, which is his work on ethics, which is goodness. And then Critique of Judgment. So 3 works: truth, goodness. You can guess what Critique of Judgment's about. The other Platonic form of beauty. Truth, beauty, goodness. These things were so rich, so complex, so dense, that Kant himself went about writing basically the cliff notes for each of these major works. And so, in addition to Critique of Practical Reason, for instance, we also have the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which sounds more complicated, but it's actually the synopsis of. And so the Critique of Pure Reason here about truth, about knowledge, about understanding. And so on page 41 then he talks about, let me back up to page 40. There can be no doubt that all of our knowledge begins with experience. Okay? So the rationalists, remember, especially Descartes and Plato and so forth, want to get beyond the senses. They want to get beyond experience, right? They want to transcend. They want to get up here. That this is where real knowledge is the intelligible realm, not the visible realm. That's just opinions and so on and so forth. Kant's already criticizing that particular notion. No doubt that